Okay, so just a couple quick things before we start. Remember that response paper 5 is due on Friday. Finish the vocab quiz by Sunday, and the paper 1 proposal is due on Monday, right? So if you want to bounce ideas off of me before you submit something, that's great. I would love to hear your ideas. Please do send them to me. But yeah, the 250-word proposal itself is going to be due on Monday. So we're also going to be doing for Monday our last readings in Volume D, right? So these are all in the section on Romanticism and Orientalism. And after this, we're going to be switching to the Victorian volume, that's Volume E, when we start looking at Thomas Carlyle next Wednesday. Also, since the exam is coming up in not too terribly long, one thing I would like to do, one thing I will be doing over the weekend is sending you a set of sample essay questions that you can use to practice for the exam. I'm not going to give you the exact detailed questions that will be on the exam, but the questions I will give you some idea of the kind of general themes you're going to be asked about, right? The kinds of things I'm going to expect you to know. The questions on the exam itself will be more specific than the sample questions. So does anybody have any questions about anything?
Are we doing the midterm exam from home, or are we doing it here?
Because there are only 5 of us in the class, I think it's reasonably safe to do it here. And one of the reasons why I think it's actually better to do it here is that we often have an easier time recalling information in the place where we learned it. So I'm hoping that if we do the exam here, you will actually do better on it than you would if you took it at home. Another reason for this, if I gave it to you at home, it would be an open book exam. That often works as a kind of double-edged sword, though, because I've noticed that when I give people open book exams, they spend too much time looking up shit in the book and not enough time actually working on the exam questions. So, there won't be, you won't be required to make any kind of direct quotations on the exam, but I am going to want you to know about kind of like general course themes and patterns, right? Now, in terms of the identification section of the exam, you've actually already got a kind of study bank for that in the vocab quizzes, right? I will be taking all of the words for the ID portion from the vocab quizzes. So probably the best thing to do there, the best way to study that, to make sure you do well in that section, because frankly it's been my experience that is where students tend to mess up most often. Go through the vocab quizzes, make yourself some flashcards, right? Put the definition on one side of an index card, put the relevant text and author name on the other side of the flashcard, and use that to study, right? That has proven to be effective for a lot of people. Does anybody have any other questions about the exam or about the paper?
You say all the readings that we've done so far is fair game for the paper?
Yes, anything that we've done so far you can do the paper on. And the exam will cover everything that we have done up to the point of the exam. So it'll be everything like up to and including, I think, Thomas Carlyle, which is what we're doing in the middle of next week. Yes, Jamal?
So what's the layout of the exam besides the IDs?
Okay, so it's going to be in 2 sections, right? The first is going to be an essay section. So I'm going to give everybody blue books. You are going to write a 500-word essay that answers one of the 3 essay questions. Then I will give you a set of 12 IDs. You will answer 8 of those questions. So you'll have 12 to choose from. You'll pick 8. You'll pick one of 3 essay questions to choose from. You'll have the normal amount of class time to do this. So you'll have 75 minutes to do this. So generally, what seems to work best for people is taking about 45 minutes on the essay and then half an hour on the IDs. But make sure you give yourself enough time to get both parts of the exam done. And also remember that the essay is worth more than the IDs are. Yes, Aaron?
We can type this essay, correct?
No, I'm going to give you guys blue books.
How will we know it'll be 500?
You can count, right? So yeah, what I would suggest you do, right, is every time you finish a paragraph, just count how many words are in that paragraph and add it to whatever was in the last paragraph. This is one of the reasons also why I'm giving you sample questions in advance to help you better prepare, right? So one thing to remember is, though, because this is another thing that screws people up, all of the essay questions will ask you to compare texts to each other, right? So if you only talk about one text in your essay exam question, you've already fucked it up, right? Make sure you're comparing two texts in each of your essay responses. But yeah, and take some time to practice with the sample questions with a couple of different texts, right? That way you'll be ready when exam time comes. And yeah, I mean we're not that far away from midterm here, guys. I mean, like this has been a fast couple of weeks. Does anybody have any other questions?
I got one question. Okay,
Yes.
so you said that all of the essays required is to compare two texts. Will we be given two texts, or will we have to choose on our own the two texts that we will compare?
So generally, the exam question itself will ask you about one specific text. It'll be up to you to find another text to compare it to, but you'll be given one of the texts in the question. Any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about Mary Shelley then. How'd this go for you? What'd you guys think?
My favorite so far.
Okay, why did you like this one? Why was this your favorite Serenity?
Because it was like it was a story.
Okay.
And I felt like it was easier to read.
Okay, yeah, this is probably easier to follow than most of the other stuff we read, right? One, it's a full short story. It's not excerpted from a longer piece, right? It's not written in verse. And yeah, so it is a little easier to grasp what's going on, right? So what else did people enjoy about reading this story? Like, what else did you like about this story?
It made me depressed.
Okay, it made you depressed.
Yes.
Why did it make you depressed, Jamal?
Because this man's immortal, and it's like, well, everybody's gone, and now I'm just sitting here waiting on God.
Okay, yeah, it's not a terribly happy story, yeah. The comment on immortality here, or the possibility of immortality, is at best ironic, right? Others, like, what else did you guys think or feel about this before we really get into it?
Kind of wish we got more Cornelius.
Okay, why did you find Cornelius interesting?
Oh, just the fact that he's this alchemist guy that's working on this potion. Like, I'm curious about his reasons for wanting this to happen.
Okay. Well, one thing I can actually give you a little more information about this character, right? For one thing, he's a real historical figure. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa was a real person. He was a legal scholar, a magician, a theologian, and an alchemist in the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th century. So, the Holy Roman Empire doesn't exist anywhere, but like, kind of think like Central Europe, right? Germany, Austria, parts of what's now the Czech Republic, and like, so on and so forth. Now, do we notice anything strange about this list? Like, does this list of accomplishments or this list of roles seem unusual to us? What's weird about it?
Those who exist now.
Okay, yeah, on the one hand, we don't have so many magicians and alchemists running around, right? And the combination of magician and alchemist with legal scholar and theologian seems weird, right?
You got reason and spirituality together.
What's that?
You got reason and spirituality and science all together.
Yeah, which again, like in a late medieval intellectual system, is not weird, right? We separate these things from each other. In Agrippa's time, people really didn't. So, in his own day, there were people who were suspicious of some of Agrippa's magical pursuits in particular, right? But by and large, this was a guy who was a respected scholar. So earlier European intellectual systems didn't make such clean divisions between subjects at all. And in particular, didn't really make so much division as we tend to think between what we call reason and superstition, right? In fact, one of the archetypal examples of this, like the music that I was playing for the beginning of class, was from Charles Gounod's 1859 opera Faust. Are any of you familiar with the Faust legend? Is this name familiar to any of you?
Dr. Faust.
Okay, yeah. So that's exactly what it is. Yeah. So what do you know about Faust or Dr. Faustus?
He sold his soul to a demon so he could gain knowledge.
Yeah. It's the story of a university professor who has become bored with the limits of human knowledge, or has become frustrated with the limits of human knowledge. So he sells his soul to the devil in order to know everything, right? He wants to know the things that human sciences can't teach him. And what he learns is that there are also limits set by God to what the devils can show him and teach him. And they eventually just kind of lead him into a life of dissipation and decadence. And at the end of the story, he's dragged off to hell, right? So you've got this guy who was this lofty scholar who ends up playing childish pranks on people using magic, and then he goes to hell. And that's the basic story, right? But this also kind of provides the model for a particular type of romantic literary hero. We've already seen something a little bit like this in the Gothic, right? This idea of the overreacher. And in particularly in the work of several of Mary Shelley's male contemporaries, in particular Lord Byron and her husband, Percy Shelley, we see these male figures who are dissatisfied with things as they are, who are dissatisfied with the limits placed on them by society, and who try to step over them, right? Who try to step outside of them. And kind of like make the world conform to their visions and their desires rather than having to conform to what the world is, right? So that's a context that's informing what's going on in this story, right? In particular, the kind of ironic treatment of immortality. Now, we talk about Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa here, right? And his role in the story. So, Jamal, you were curious about him specifically because he's this alchemist pursuing this elixir of life, right? So I think one thing we need to note here is the story sets up two different kinds of immortality. What's the kind of immortality that Lindsay has?
Literal.
Yeah, literal physical immortality, right? He doesn't age, and as far as he knows, he cannot die. Now, if we look on page 1036 here, when Agrippa is first mentioned, all the world has heard of Cornelius Agrippa. His memory is as immortal as his arts have made me. All the world has also heard of his scholar who unawares raised the foul fiend during his master's absence and was destroyed by him, right? So, does Agrippa actually have a kind of immortality? What kind of immortality does he have?
Remember.
Yeah, he is immortal in memory, right? Right? People remember Agrippa. Even though at the time the story is being told, he's been dead for over 300 years, right? Why do they remember him?
Because of the things he's done.
Yeah, because he did shit, right? Now, what has Windsor done with his literal physical immortality?
Leaving.
Well, actually, none of this takes place in England. The beginning of the story is in what is now Germany, and then he flees into France, right? But has Windsor done any kind of noteworthy deeds with his immortality? He's done nothing, right? He has done no deeds. He has no children, right? He's leaving behind nothing. So, I think one thing we want to keep in mind as we read this is the way the story deals with this whole idea of immortality and what it means to be immortal in both of these senses, right? Now, one thing that might help us think about this, again, not to get too deeply biographical here, right? But what do we remember from last time about Mary Shelley's generation of romantic writers?
They died young.
They all died young, yeah. She outlives her husband and all his friends, right? Now, this becomes particularly problematic because, when Percy Shelley falls off of a boat and drowns at age 29, Mary is left with small children to care for in Italy, in a country where she has no friends and no support system. And on top of this, Percy Shelley's father, so Percy Shelley was a member of the minor nobility who had a small income, right? That was kind of granted him by the state. When Percy Shelley dies, all of that reverts not to his wife, but to his father. And Sir Thomas Shelley was a cantankerous old Tory who had no truck with his son's radical politics or with his weird wife or bizarre personal life or anything, right? He kind of wanted his son's name written out of the history books. And so, he largely refused to support Mary and her children. Now, what that means for Mary is that she is essentially writing for her bread, right? Writing for money. Because her source of family income has dried up. And in order to appease Sir Thomas, who eventually agrees to give her a small allowance, she largely has to do so anonymously. Right? It's relatively late in her career that she actually starts signing her name to anything. Because Sir Thomas Shelley doesn't want the Shelley name on any of these weird romantic literary productions. Right? He doesn't want it tainted by scandal as he sees it, right? Now, Mary herself comes from a pretty prestigious lineage of 18th century intellectuals, right? Her father is the political philosopher and Gothic novelist William Godwin. Her mother was the feminist and radical philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. So she's highly educated for a woman of her time, although not conventionally educated. She wouldn't have been able to go to university or anything like that. But she grew up in a household full of books with parents who were intellectually engaged in her education and, kind of wanted to kind of make a prodigy out of their daughter, right? So we have this highly accomplished, highly intelligent woman who is writing for money throughout the 1820s, right? Now she finds a particular source of income in writing for what are called literary annuals or gift books. And these were publications that came out yearly. The first was the Forget-Me-Not, which began publishing in 1823. This story appeared in The Keepsake, which first appeared in 1829. Do we see a pattern in the kind of names that were given to these kinds of books? Forget-Me-Not, Keepsake. What do they have in common? Just on the level of language here. What's that?
They sound like gifts.
Yeah, okay, they sound like gifts, right? And in particular, yeah, remembrance gifts, right? Yeah. So these books were richly produced and beautifully decorated and illustrated. So to give you an example of what these look like, I'm going to show you the cover of the first edition of the Forget-Me-Not, and then the frontispiece of the first edition of the Keepsake. And we wait. So we see here that the cover is highly ornamented, right? It's the title is written out in this fancy calligraphy, right? Forget-Me-Not, a Christmas and New Year's present for 1823, right? Clearly intended as a gift. And this is the frontispiece of the first edition of the Keepsake, right? The Keepsake for 1829. So the audience for these books, the people to whom, not the people that's buying them necessarily, but the people to whom they were given as gifts, were typically middle-class women. So that might not be who's buying these books, but that's who's consuming them, who's reading them, right? Or, even if they're not reading them, they're displaying them, right? These are books that aren't necessarily intended for people to sit and read and pore over. They're things you put out on a coffee table for people to come and look through when they visit, right? They're full of illustrations. And to give you some sense of what was most valued in these books, they actually got really important celebrity authors to write for these things. Wordsworth wrote poems, for example, to be published in these books. but the illustrators were always paid more than the writers. Now, there's one illustration that accompanies the mortal immortal in The Keepsake for 1830. And this is it. Now, what moment in the story does this illustrate?
Bertha and her protectors.
Yeah, this is Bertha and the rich old woman who has adopted her, right? And the servant holding up the old woman's dress so it doesn't trail in the dirt, right? Is this surprising to you in any way?
In what way?
Okay, if you were going to draw a picture to accompany this story, what character would you probably have included?
Lindsay?
Yeah, Winsy's not in this picture, right? Winsy's not in this picture. Agrippa's not in this picture. We've just got Bertha and her protectress and the servant, right? Why do you think the illustrator chose this image for this story?
I thought it was because Wednesday was like coming towards them, so maybe it's like
Okay, so yeah,
front view.
the story is told from Winsy's perspective, right? So this could just be, sort of Winsy looking at. But there's no real trace of him in the picture, right? There's no suggestion of his presence necessarily. Yeah, Nick, what you're going to say?
It might be more relatable to a middle-class woman to have that picture rather than Lindsay.
Bingo. It's a question of audience, right? I think the other thing that we need to note here as well is that a reader in 1830, particularly a middle-class woman reading this in 1830, might not have seen this as Winsy's story, but instead might have seen it as Bertha's story. Here's why. Let's start with what all of you thought of Bertha from reading this. Like what sense of Bertha did you get from reading this? What kind of person is she? What stood out to you about her?
In the beginning or towards the end?
The whole thing. Whenever, wherever.
She kind of sounded more mean.
I didn't like her towards the end because she was like, oh, let's just run away. I feel like she should have kept that same energy she's had at the start.
Okay. But why doesn't she have the same energy at the end of the story she had at the beginning?
She was.
Well, also, what's happened to her and hasn't happened to him?
She aged.
Yeah, she ages and he doesn't, right?
I don't know. I kind of felt like her energy was a bit consistent throughout, because
Okay.
even when they would meet up by the lake or whatever,
Mhm.
she would be so mean to him when he
Okay.
would come late.
Okay. So, what about her strikes you as mean?
She called him submissive something. She called him submissive or something.
Uh-huh.
And then, like, she was like impatient.
Okay.
And then she would like, was it threats? Like threats
Yeah.
him kind of?
Well, and in particular, what kinds of things does she threaten him with when they're young?
Like
And
going
somebody
to,
else.
yeah.
Yeah. Like, bestowing her favors on other suitors, right? Like when she goes off hunting with this Albert Hofer, right? Who is this guy that her protectress would prefer her to marry, right? So, why is she so anxious for Winsy to get money?
So she could get away from the protectress.
Uh-huh. Yeah, she can't marry him until he has money, right? Now, let's look at what Bertha's situation is, right? Is she actually related to her protectress?
No.
What happened to her parents?
They both had
Yeah, she's an orphan, right? So she is, from the beginning of the story, dependent on other people for her survival, right? She is dependent on the old woman until Winsey has enough money to marry her, right? At which point she becomes dependent on Winsey. Why is she dependent on other people?
That's all she really knows.
It's the only role society allows her, right? A young woman, I guess, like in this case, and the story's taking place in the mid 16th century, right? But it's got analogs with women's roles socially in the early 19th century as well, right? It might help if we think back to Dorothy Wordsworth's situation as well, right? What happens to, why is Dorothy Wordsworth's brother's marriage such a traumatic event for her?
She always took care of them.
Yeah, it means that she's no longer the center of the household, right? She is pushed aside for somebody else. And as an unmarried middle-class woman, right, there's no other easy social role for her to fill. I think there's a similar thing going on with Bertha, right? And that a lot of Bertha's behavior would be interpreted by the original readers of the story in that light. Yes, Serenity, what were you going to say?
With what you're saying, could that relate to when Winsey was like, I'm gonna leave or whatever, and she didn't want him to leave? Is it like true love, or was it because of that reason?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, what happens to her if he leaves?
She has nothing.
Yeah. He works the farm and sells their produce, right? She has, she doesn't have an independent existence, or any real capability for an independent existence. Again, not because of any fault in her necessarily, but because of the way social structures are set up, right? So Bertha's basically trapped any way you look at it. As a young woman, she's trapped by her protectress. As an old woman, she's still bound to Winsey, and Winsey remains bound to her for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, regardless of feelings at that point, right? What is the source of Bertha's power over Winsey when they're young? Why is she able to get him to do what she wants when they're young?
He loves her.
Yeah, what does he love about her? Why does he love her?
He likes her voice.
Yeah, because she's beautiful, right? So yeah, her power, right? The power she has over him rests primarily in physical beauty, right? This is what makes her marriageable, right? This is her currency on the marriage market. And then, why is it so traumatic for her when he stays young and good looking and she doesn't?
Because she would no longer have the power over him.
Yeah. Her power over him fades, right? And that love and regard that he had for her when they were young changes into something else by the end. If we look at page 1043, when Bertha dies, why dwell on these minute circumstances? We lived on for many long years. Bertha became bedridden, paralytic. I nursed her as a mother might a child. She grew peevish and still harped upon one string, of how long I should survive her. it has ever been a source of consolation to me that I performed my duty scrupulously towards her. She had been mine in youth, she was mine in age, and at last, when I heaped the sod over her corpse, I wept to feel that I had lost all that really bound me to humanity. So first off, what do we notice he says nothing about in this paragraph? In regards to the way he feels about his wife.
You didn't say anything about love or beauty.
Yeah, nothing about love in this paragraph, right? What do we have instead? How does he console himself as he buries her?
This is the last thing holding him to humanity.
Okay, yeah, so that's what makes him weep, right? That this is the last thing that connects him to humanity. So we'll talk about that in a second. But what is the thing that he finds consolation in?
He did his duty.
I performed my duty, yes. So what was love in youth becomes duty and responsibility in old age, right? He didn't take care of her because he loved her, because he took care of her because he felt responsible for her, right? Yeah, the prior page on 1042, right? I returned the good soul's embrace heartily. I will not, my Bertha, but for your sake, I had not thought of such a thing. I will be your true, faithful husband while you are spared to me, and do my duty by you to the last, right? So yeah, as they get older, Lindsay is less consumed by love and more consumed by ideas of duty towards Bertha. Now, let's get back to the sentence that Aaron cited a second ago here, right? When he cries at her death, is he crying for her? He's crying for himself, right? Because she's his last real human connection. Right? He's now cursed to lonely wandering, right? With no other companion. So he experiences her death as a disaster for himself, right? Not because he misses her specifically, because it sounds like by the time she dies, she's become a pain in the ass, but because he misses human society generally, right? So Bertha is almost like an abstraction of that to him. So we can kind of see how this might look to a middle-class woman reading this story in 1830, right? You've got a young, beautiful woman who exercises great power over her young suitor and really can have her pick of young men, right? But she chooses this poor guy instead of the rich young men who were coming after her. But then, from the moment she chooses him, she becomes more and more dependent on him. Especially as he doesn't change while she does. And eventually, she changes so much due to the natural processes of aging that she has no real power over him. And indeed, in the 19th century, married women, while they ran their households, they had very little power outside of the household, right? They had few legal rights. And, as long as their husbands were discreet in their affairs outside of the house, had no particular rights to question their man, right? So, this, I think, is what a woman reading this in 1830 would see in Bertha. Right, kind of analog for a fairly normal situation. And I think one of the reasons why it helps us to look at the story from that perspective, because it stops us from judging the character of Bertha too harshly, right? That Bertha is trying to survive in a world that's not really made for her survival. Now, the other context I want to talk about here is kind of going back to the Faust thing, the context of late 18th and early 19th century science, and that connection that it still kind of has to magic, right? So what do we remember from previous sessions about this whole notion of the age of reason, of rationalism? What did the so-called Enlightenment promise to do with superstition and fantasy?
Get rid of it.
Yeah, banish it, right? It's all ignorance anyway, right? Once we apply rigorous scientific principles to reality, we can figure out how things work, and we no longer have to rely on, explanations like, the breath of God or magic elves or things like that, right? We can kind of break these things down into specific physical causes and effects. But that divorce between science and magic happens really, really slowly. And in fact, the figure of the scientist remains pretty close in a lot of ways in the public imagination to the figure of the wizard. So this is a painting from 1768. It's called An Experiment Upon a Bird in an Air Pump. And it was painted by the artist Joseph Wright of Derby. To avoid confusing him with other Joseph Wrights who were not from Derby. Now let's spend a minute looking at this painting and just tell me what you notice here. Tell me what seems odd or unusual about this if we're talking about, say, like, how does this seem strange for a science experiment to you? Can we tell what's going on here?
There's a lot of people there doing this.
Okay, yeah, there are a lot of people watching, right? And the basic experiment, right, the way this works is there's a bird in this glass bubble on top of this pump apparatus, right? And what the scientist is doing is sucking the air out of the bubble, which causes the bird to start to suffocate, and then releasing the air back in, which causes the bird to revive, right? So on the one hand, this actually sounds incredibly cruel to us, right? This is something that would not pass, an internal review board at a modern university. This would be considered cruel. But, yeah, what do we notice about the people around the scientist? First off, what are the light sources in the painting? Where's the light coming from? What's that? This thing? Yeah, there's like this kind of weird chemical concoction here that's glowing, right? And most of the light in the picture is coming from this. Although we do have an assistant over here opening a shade, right? So that there's moonlight coming in as well. But yeah, most of the light is coming from this weird chemical concoction here. And it's like, we can see it kind of like lighting the bottoms of people's faces, right? What do we notice about the spectators and their responses to this? Apart from the fact that just there are an awful lot of people witnessing this, right?
A woman is being consoled by two other people.
Feels like the men are being rational and the women are being emotional.
Yeah. We've got, these two young girls here, right, are clearly upset by the experiment. And this man, probably their father, is trying to comfort them and explain to them what's going on, right? We got another guy sort of sitting here lost in thought, looking pensive. We got a man and a boy here looking up in rapt fascination. And then we got, like, what's going on with this couple over here? What does it look like they're doing? Are they even watching the experiment? No, they're more interested in each other, right? This looks like a couple on a date or something, right? It's like, it seems like a weird idea to us, right? Hey, let's go watch some guy suffocate a bird, right? Won't that be fun? But yeah, so essentially what we have here is science experiment as public performance. And this is one of the major differences between contemporary science and early Enlightenment science, right? Is that science experiments were often performed in public, in dramatic ways, right? To try to, get public attention and generate public interest. For example, Mary Shelley herself, when she was a young woman, saw an exhibition by an Italian scientist by the name of Luigi Galvani. And Galvani had discovered that our movements are governed by electrical impulses that come from our brains, right? So every time I move my hand or make marks on the board with the marker, right, there's an electrical impulse running down my nervous system from my brain to this part of my body to perform that action, right? Now, the way Galvani demonstrated this publicly was through a kind of visually dramatic experiment, right? He had a pair of severed frog's legs that he would attach to an electrode. And when he attached the wires to the electrode, right, the legs jumped. So science to ordinary people in this period still looked a lot like magic, right? Like, how are those legs jumping if they're not attached to a frog, right? And if we look at the figure of the scientist here, does this guy look the way you imagine the scientist? I mean, look, he's wearing robes, he's got long gray hair.
He looks like Isaac Newton.
Okay, he looks like Isaac Newton to you, which this would be about the right period. Although, Newton was a reclusive weirdo. Does this guy look more like a scientist or more like a magician?
Magician.
Yeah. So yeah, in the public imagination, the scientist is very closely attached still in this period to the notion of the magician, right? Because they do things that look like magic, even though all they're doing is relying on certain physical principles. So for example, like when this experiment was performed for the public in the 1760s, it was shortly after a guy by the name of Joseph Priestley had discovered oxygen, right? So this is a way of kind of communicating that discovery to the public in a visually dramatic way, right? So this mix of science and superstition also informs the way this story is structured, right? I think particularly if we look at the way it informs Cornelius's reputation. Right? What is Cornelius's reputation at the time Winsey goes to work for him? I'm sorry, what did you say, Serenity?
I said he doesn't have a good reputation.
Yeah, why not? What do people think he does?
They
sus.
Like some type of evil spirits or something.
Yeah, they think that this is a guy who traffics with evil spirits, right? They think that he summons up demons and that, it's dangerous thus to go work for him because you're not only is your body in danger, but your very soul, right? There's, this story about his scholar, his pupil, who accidentally was going through his books and accidentally raised the devil and was destroyed, right? Now, what does Winsey discover about Cornelius's actual work once he takes the money and goes to work for him? Does it have anything to do with devils or summoning spirits? Now, yeah, what is the primary thing that Winsey has to do?
Keep watch of his experience.
I'm like an intern.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the job you give to an intern, right? Yeah, basically what he has to do is just kind of like watch all of these like bubbling concoctions that this guy has going, right? So Cornelius's work is kind of just, essentially looks to us basically like chemistry, right? Even if there is a kind of element of magic to it, and then he's, waiting for this rosy glow so he can consume the potion and become immortal. But yeah, there's nothing particularly sinister about any of it, right? But, because it's a little bit secretive, and because it involves processes that most people don't understand, right? They come to connect it with magic. Now, what do we note about, what else is important about Cornelius's experiments? Why does he need an assistant?
Gotta get sleep.
Yeah, he's got to sleep sometime, right? But even like that whole need for sleep thing, right? What does that indicate about the kind of work Cornelius does? Can one person do it alone?
It's not really meant for one person to go home.
Yeah.
It's constant.
Yeah, it's constant, and it requires cooperation, right? It requires at least 2 sets of eyes and 2 sets of hands. And if you look on page 1036, right? All his scholars at once deserted him. His servants disappeared. He had no one near him to put coals on his ever-burning fires while he slept, or to attend to the changeful colors of his medicines while he studied. Experiment after experiment failed because one pair of hands was insufficient to complete them. So we can associate this with the larger pattern of solitude and loneliness in the story, right? What does solitude seem to lead to? Yeah. And what does Winsey's immortality force on him? Solitude. Yeah. So immortality equals solitude equals failure. And at the end of the story, he has failed to make anything of his 300 years of life, right? We don't get much sense of anything that he's done since Bertha has died, apart from questioning whether or not he really is immortal, right? Part of the problem with immortality is you don't know if you can be killed until someone tries, right? So if we turn to the end of the story, page 1044 here, right? Am I immortal? I return to my first question. In the first place, is it not more probable that the beverage of the alchemist was fraught rather with longevity than eternal life? Such is my hope. And then be it remembered that I drank only half the potion prepared by him. Was not the whole necessary to complete the charm? To have drained half the elixir of immortality is but to be half immortal. My forever is thus truncated and null. But again, who shall number the years of the half of eternity? I often try to imagine by what rule the infinite may be divided. Sometimes I fancy age advancing upon me. One gray hair I have found. Fool, do I lament? Yes. The fear of age and death often creeps coldly into my heart, and the more I live, the more I dread death, even while I abhor life. Such an enigma is man, born to perish, when he wars, as I do, against the established laws of his nature. And I take this back for a minute. Right? So Winzy's whole existence by this point has become kind of lonely and solipsistic, right? He only thinks, he lives entirely in his own head. What was it Cornelius initially told him the potion would do? Yeah, in order to get him not to drink it, right? Cornelius told him the potion would cure love. Was he telling the truth?
To some degree.
Yeah. Because what this potion has ended up doing is severing all of Winzy's connections to other people, right? So it doesn't kill love right away, right? But in the end, that is exactly what happens. Right? Even Winzy's connection to Bertha becomes caught up in duty rather than actual love. So we're about at the end of time here. Does anybody have any questions or comments they want to make about this?
Why didn't Cornelius tell Winzy what the purpose of the event was from the beginning?
Well, if somebody told you that they were going to go take a nap while you watched their elixir that was going to make you live forever, wouldn't that be a pretty strong temptation to drink it? Even just out of curiosity? So Agrippa doesn't want Winzy to drink the potion, right? So he tells him, oh, it'll kill love. It'll make you not love anymore. Without telling him why it does that, right? Or how it works that way. Because Agrippa wants it for himself. Now, ironically, Cornelius Agrippa ends up getting immortality anyway. Just not the kind he wanted. While Winzy ends up with the kind of immortality he'd intended for himself and finds it useless, right? Anything else? Okay, then let me give you the guide questions for next time.
What were the pages that were?
It is all on the syllabus.
Okay.
It's just like I can't recall off the top of my head. Yeah.